Hello, my name is Amy Verdun, and I'm here with Valerie D'Erman from the University of Victoria to talk about the European Union's external trade policy. The European Union has not only established a single market that eliminates internal trade barriers in between the member states, but it also acts as a cohesive actor in setting the rules for external trade with countries outside of the EU. Could you explain how this works?
Thank you, yes. First, what this means is that the European Commission acts as the sole negotiator for the entire European Union, all 27 member states. This not only means that the European Commission is the central actor, it is also the sole actor. This means that none of the member states can negotiate or conclude international trade agreements of their own. So, for example, France is beholden to all of the trade negotiations that the EU conducts, and there can be no independent, say, French third-party international trade agreements. This first originated with what was then called the Common Commercial Policy within the 1957 Treaty of Rome. The intention within one of the major intentions of the Treaty of Rome was to begin the inception of a common market, the newly created European Economic Community. Part of this was to facilitate the movement of goods and services among the founding 6 members. In order to facilitate this, they had to simultaneously create a customs union in order to have one common tariff for goods that were being imported from any countries that were not a part of the original 6 within the European Economic Community. Going forward, the Single European Act and the Maastricht Treaty made for important institutional developments in EU trade policies. By the time of the Treaty of Lisbon, external trade had become what's called an exclusive power of the European Union. Exclusive power means that individual member states are not able to independently legislate on trade matters, and they are not permitted to negotiate their own international trade agreements outside the EU. There is, of course, plenty of room for input, guidance, protest, etc., but the formal legal authority lies with the European Union Commission.
The Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA, that the EU concluded with Canada is a good example of the types of trade agreements made by the EU. Can you explain the most important provisions of CETA?
CETA is a great example of the current types of trade agreements made by the EU, not just because it's an agreement between the EU and Canada for our audience of predominantly Canadian students. It's a great example because it is so emblematic of what trade scholars call a second-generation international trade agreement. What that refers to is that the first generation, quote unquote, of trade agreements were really about goods or trade in goods and services. And to that end, mostly manufactured tangible goods that could be weighed and measured and sold. CETA, notably, has extensive provisions that go beyond trade in goods and lead into trade in all kinds of services, whether architectural, professional, financial, etc. What's very significant is that CETA is one of the deepest international trade agreements that engages with issues of trade and public procurement, so governments buying things for their own localized needs, intellectual property, trade in financial investments of different kinds. It also has significant provisions, significant both in that they're new to the EU and to Canada, but significant in terms of setting precedents for the rest of the world for dispute settlement mechanisms, a very formal legal body. And for Canada in particular, this agreement is interesting because it is the first instance of Canada opening up large swaths of trade and agriculture, which previously Canada had been quite protectionist on.
Could you use the example of CETA to describe how the EU negotiates and approves trade agreements?
I'll first do a quick overview of what that process is, and then I'll speak to some of the details of CETA. The process of achieving a trade agreement between the EU and a non-EU country first begins with the decision of even whether to consider a preferential agreement with this country. This means that the Commission holds a public consultation on the topic, conducts an assessment of the third-party country in question, and then undertakes a scoping exercise on the country, collecting information, speaking to local stakeholders, and ascertaining what range of issues might come out of any sort of negotiations. After doing all this, the Commission then requests formal authorization from the Council, intergovernmental in nature, to begin negotiations. The Council then has the authority to set out the negotiating directives and to suggest changes. Once the Council has approved and furthered this process, the Commission can then open up negotiations. So quite a bit of back and forth between the Commission and the Council at first. The negotiations proceed according to whatever timeline is needed for the topics within. For CETA in particular, this process took 6 years, from 2008 to 2014. After negotiations have closed, the final text undergoes a great deal of legal scrutiny, is then translated into all the official languages of the European Union, and is then made public. Once that process has concluded, the agreement can then go up for approval, both within the EU and at the third party, within the third party country. This is where there's the question of competence. An agreement can either be considered exclusive competence of the European Union, meaning that all of the topics involved within the trade negotiations are all competencies of the EU level only. If that's the case, then the third-party country has to ratify the agreement, and then the European Union must approve it at Commission, Council, and parliamentary levels. However, some agreements contain lots of negotiations on policy areas that fall into what's called mixed competence, a balance between the competencies of the EU level in policy areas and what is still a competence of the member states. This is where CETA fell into. A great deal of the agreement was contained at the EU level of competence, and in those areas, the EU has approved it, as has the Canadian federal government. But because the agreement is mixed, because there are areas of trade negotiations that focused on investment and on intellectual property, and those are still beholden to the competence of member states, CETA needed to be approved as a mixed agreement. At the time of this interview, only 16 member states have fully concluded successful CETA negotiation.
Could you discuss how the EU uses trade as part of its broader external relations policies, including, for instance, international development policy?
When the European Economic Community first began with the common commercial policy, so having that internal customs union and then a common external tariff wall for non-EC members, there was no distinction between developed and developing countries. The only distinction that there was to perhaps consider more trade activity with colonies and former colonies of the original 6 members, as well as any preferential relationships those 6 members were bringing in. As the customs union and the common market grew, combined with the first enlargement of the EEC in 1973 to Denmark, Ireland, and the United Kingdom, this enlarged the scope of countries that were receiving special consideration. Also preceding this time was a period of decolonization in the 1960s in Africa and other parts around the world. And this spurred on greater consideration of what kinds of tools the EC had at its disposal at the time to take on preferential trading arrangements and perhaps use that as a tool to help with development in some of its preferential partners. Now, the European Union uses trade as a tool to support development in less developed countries. These include things like economic partnership agreements with countries in Africa, the Caribbean, and the Pacific, as well as other kinds of agreements with developing countries in Asia, Latin America, and the Southern Mediterranean. The goals of these agreements are to support technical, social, and environmental issues in developing countries, along with providing fully open access for these countries to export to the EU. So the EU develops relationships where they can offer developmental aid, and in exchange, they remove all tariff walls for importing goods from these countries in particular. These measures are intended to supplement development and humanitarian aid.
Some trade agreements concluded or contemplated by the EU have proven highly contentious in the EU population. What explains this contestation, and which criticism has been leveled against EU trade agreements?
There has always been some current of public criticism in the EU and its member states and in other industrialized countries around the world against too much open liberalized trade in general. This is from the general perspective that too much trade is overly neoliberal, to use that word, meaning that it perhaps invites too much of an emphasis on an export-reliant economy, which can potentially be detrimental to production for local needs. There has also been a long-standing concern, before even the development of the single market, that trade can potentially lead to too much of an outsourcing of jobs if trade relations over time create a dependence on importing fundamental goods and services that are needed in a local economy. Again, these criticisms are not unique to the European Union, and they have been a part of international trade discussions for almost a century. For the EU specifically, while international trade has largely, up until the turn of the century, been a recognized and mostly approved area within the development of the European Union single market, there have been two trade agreements that have invited a lot more public awareness and, as a result, public criticism. And to date, the ones that have received the most criticism have been the CETA agreement with Canada and a failed proposed agreement with the United States. Both of these agreements were criticized for potentially liberalizing too many areas of trade. Also, interestingly, because Canada and the US are perceived by many European actors as being too deregulated, as not having enough, from a European perspective, necessary regulations and policy areas of agriculture, labor, and the environment. So there was a concern when both of these agreements were in the negotiation stages that there could be a race to the bottom with powerful economies, of which Canada and the United States are that. The awareness of this created its own momentum of citizen groups, specific interest groups, and public protest against the idea of the EU overly involving itself in free trade with North America. CETA, of course, as we know, was concluded and ratified at the EU level. But some of the nature of the protest against CETA has informed different kinds of domestic politics in member states that have yet to fully approve the CETA agreement in their national parliaments. The proposed agreement between the United States and the European Union was called the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP for short. These talks began in 2013 and proved to be immediately contentious on both sides of the Atlantic, the United States and members of the European Union. The 2016 US election of President Donald Trump stalled these negotiation talks. They never picked up momentum again, and in 2019, the TTIP negotiations were officially paused. Since then, there has been no appetite in the European Union nor in the United States to further consider resuming these negotiations.
Thank you very much for this conversation.
Thank you.